Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. And I'm back ready to start looking at Naoki Urasawa's Monster. This is a story, as I've gotten ready to reread and really thought about my recollections of the story and compared them to what I'm looking at here, I've more and more realized that whether I realized it or not in the past, Urasawa's way of presenting moral characters here has a lot of influence on me. And I'll talk particularly about the conflicts that caused that at the end of the video. But for now, what I really hope to get out of this is not just to share with you a really great character study and suspense story, but also note how there are characters of very strong moral bearing here that are handled in such a precise and nuanced way that you still see a lot of nuance that people claim is missing from black and white characters, but which is really not. And I hope you will gain an appreciation for how well that is handled and how well people can handle characters of strong moral convictions without indulging in the trope of cartoonish stereotypes. For now, though, it's my hope that we'll be able to just take a look at some of our characters as they're being set up and we get ready for the kind of moral questions we're going to be asking. And while I don't intend to do this in every video, I do want to restate here that there is at play in this story a moral principle which Americans in particular and Westerners more generally may not be as familiar with. In Japan in particular, there is a belief that if you save a life, you then become responsible for that life, almost as if you had become a parent to the person whose life you saved. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I talk about them in a little more depth in the introduction, which I will link down below if you want to go and take a look at that. But that is a moral principle at play here that is never explicitly stated in the narrative, but I think is important to understand a lot of what happens as things go forward. And I think also it's a moral principle that people grasp intuitively, but I just wanted to restate it. And there is a lot of question over how deep and how far that responsibility would and should go. And that is kind of a central part of this story. Now, we are introduced right off the bat to our central character. The first chapter here is called Hair Dr. Tenma, and we are introduced here to Dr. Tenma. Kenzo Tenma is a neurosurgeon. He's living and working in Germany for a hospital in Dusseldorf, I believe. And he's just doing his thing. He is a very gifted surgeon. He has a lot of skill, both in what he knows and in his ability with his hands. And we see him coming out of an operation where he's just saved a life. So it's immediately a very good introduction and setup for a character who has unique skills as a doctor, but interestingly enough, not necessarily skills we're going to see him using on a regular basis as the primary driver of the story. But it also establishes that he has kind of a gift for people because everyone he talks to seems to have a liking for him. That is a really important character trait that will come up again and again. Then we have here an interesting quote. The first 4 verses of the book of Revelations, chapter 13, are quoted. It says, "And I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" And I believe this is where the title monster actually comes from. I believe that, and I've heard this. I don't have any documentation for it. This is largely internet discussion stuff, so you have to take it with a large grain of salt. But I've heard that in Revelations, the word that we translate beast is often translated as Ju or kaiju, which kind of means monster, which is, then why we get this title, because the original title, I believe, is in English, Japanized English. Monsteru, I believe, is the way they would write it in katakana. So that's the way, I believe, I would have to go and look this up. That is the actual title. So, interesting quote, and of course we see this sinister-looking face looking at us, but we don't really know a whole lot about that. We go right back into the hospital. So this is kind of a brick drop moment. More on that in a bit. If you're not familiar with a brick drop, it refers to something that is stated at one point in a story, never elaborated on for some time, and then brought up again to show you that, yes, you know, that brick we drop does ultimately have a role to play in the story. To skim lightly over the first chapter, Tenma is a surgeon at a hospital in Dusseldorf. He is dating the daughter of the director of surgery. He's very well liked by the people there. The director of surgery is kind of using him to build up his own reputation. He goes on the news after Tenma's operation and talks him up. The person operated on was a well-known opera singer, so the story is in the news. A lot of that kind of stuff. We also get a brief news story about the Lieberts, I believe is the name. Yeah. So we get a picture of them on the TV. They have just escaped from East Germany. This is in the early 1986. Excuse me, 1886. No, 1986. So Germany is still divided by the Berlin Wall. And Dusseldorf, of course, is on the west side. That's where Tenma is. And the Lieberts have just escaped from Eastern Germany. So we have Herr and Frau Liebert and their twin children. This is not quite a brick drop, but it is an important bit. And it will come up in a couple of chapters here. Anyways, after that, we see a confrontation between Tenma and this woman here. Now, after Tenma came out of his surgery, we did see her briefly in one panel crying in the hospital hallway. And it turned out that her husband was brought in for an operation at the same time that Tenma was operating, and her husband died. Nothing terribly unusual about that. Not every surgery goes well. But eventually, at this point, Tenma is confronted by her, and he finds out that her husband, a Turkish immigrant and day laborer, was brought in before the opera singer that Tenma actually operated on. In fact, Tenma was initially scrubbing up to operate on this Turkish man before he was diverted to the opera singer. And this is, first of all, just a really lousy thing to do. You know, say, we're going to help save this person, and then change and say, no, we're going to help save that person. But more importantly, it's a violation of the rules of triage and of medical ethics, at least for Dr. Tenma. He has ignored triage to favor one patient over another because the one patient is famous and will make the hospital look good. In fact, no one ever says it explicitly, but it's kind of implied that Tenma a man of Tenma's gifts may not have been needed to operate on the opera singer. Of course, the other neurosurgeon they had on hand was not as skilled, may not have been able to save the opera singer's life, but that doesn't mean a whole lot to this Turkish woman who has come to confront Tenma and demand her husband's life back, which of course he can't do. This is important because it sets up Dr. Tenma in the horns of a dilemma. He doesn't handle the surgery schedule. He didn't really know. No one told him explicitly that he was being taken off of one case and put on another. He was just told to go to a different surgery than the one he had been originally scrubbing up to enter. And so Dr. Tenma, a man of very good principles, of good intent, and excellent skills, has found himself guilty of something unethical because of information that was withheld from him. And there's not a whole lot he can do about that, but it does put him at odds with his fiancée, with his mentor in Germany, the director of surgery. Creates a lot of problems for him, and it also emotionally hurts him a lot because he felt that he was doing good work as a doctor. And right away, we have a case of what I like to call Othello morality. We see what originally looks like a good action, recontextualized by the actions of others, become at least an inadvertently unethical one. And that is going to be a theme in Tenma's life. But he also goes out of his way to correct it. Tenma protests this to the director of surgery. He's kind of put off as a naive surgeon. Hospitals have to maintain their reputation and funding, he's told. But he decides that he's not going to go along with this anymore. So when he's called in again for an emergency surgery to deal with a child of 10 years old who has a gunshot wound to the head, a bullet has entered his skull, but hasn't killed him outright. And then later on, we're told that an important member of the town council, I forget what the German term for that is, but essentially the town council, has had a stroke and requires surgery to repair the aneurysm. Tenma is told to go and operate on the councilman, but he refuses. He operates on the child instead. And it turns out that the child that he saved was one of the Liebert twins. It was Johan Liebert. And he had just been shot in the head. And it's generally believed, because his parents, the Lieberts, Herr and Frau Liebert, were found dead, it's generally believed this was retribution for defecting. And the Soviets had tried to wipe out the whole family, but they had only gotten the parents. And the hospital actually gets a boost in reputation for this, because, hey, they saved the lives of these poor people who escaped from East Germany. The director of surgery takes credit for that, and Dr. Tenma, for defying the director of surgery, is basically put on grunt work. He doesn't get as much surgery, he doesn't get as many opportunities to advance his career, and he's kind of held back for a month or so. And once again, the director of surgery is taking credit for Tenma's accomplishments. He's doing press releases about saving the life of Johann Liebert. He's getting his picture taken with Anna Liebert, Johann's sister, who is catatonic with shock. She's not, really responding to outside stimulus. So kind of gross that, you're having these PR pictures taken and, letting the press come in and ask questions in front of her. So the director of surgery, kind of a scummy guy. Yeah. But for his part, Dr. Tenma rededicates himself to the purpose of saving lives. And he's grateful because Johan has kind of opened his eyes. There's this interesting scene where Johan is in recovery. He hasn't woken up from surgery yet. And Tenma talks to himself about the things that have brought him here. He says he wanted to do research. He came here because eventually he figured he could, move up much better than he could in the Japanese medical system. He could research whatever he wants. But now he's realized that as a doctor, his first obligation is to save lives. And in spite of what he was told by the director of surgery and his fiancée, he thinks that all lives are of equal value, that he did the right thing. And then he says something kind of reckless. He says he wishes that the people who have punished him for his actions were dead. And he gets what he wants, interestingly enough. A few days later, the director of surgery and some of the other doctors who have conspired against Tenma are eating from some of the gifts, because Johan has been given a lot of gifts. He's escaped from East Germany. The West Germans are very sympathetic and welcoming to him and his sister. After his parents are murdered, there's a lot of grief and sympathy poured out to the Liebert twins. They bring in gifts of candy, of food, of flowers. And since Johan is pretty much on a liquid diet right now, the doctors are like, hey, what does it hurt to eat some of this, candy that's been brought in while we're discussing the case? Well, it turns out that candy was laced with poison, and the doctors, all three of them, die. In exchange, Dr. Tenma is appointed the head of surgery, and he basically gets a chance to reform his life. He reforms the hospital. He reintroduces, correct medical ethics in triage. He gets more opportunities to set his own research. Everything about his life seems a lot better. But it's really not as great as it might seem at first glance. We're introduced in this sequence as well to Inspector Lunge. Inspector Lunge is from, he's from originally the BKA, which is, I guess, a German investigation service. Later, he works for Interpol. But he finds Tenma's role in all this very suspicious. It's fairly convenient that these people have just died and left him with the chance to move into the director of surgery position. But for years, literally for 10 years, Tenma manages to occupy that position without a whole lot of danger, and he finds his life pretty fulfilling there. He gets to do the research he wants to do. He gets to shape the hospital to meet his expectations, and so on and so forth. And for a decade, which is passed over in just a few pages here, nothing really comes of that until Inspector Lunge comes back. And this is Inspector Lunge. I love his design. He feels almost like Spock has shown up on a comics page. He doesn't have the ears, but he has that focus, that intensity, and even kind of a little bit of Leonard Nimoy in his face. Really, he reminds me most of all of Basil Rathbone's Sherlock Holmes. He's very analytical, kind of emotionally distant, and very driven by his job. But he shows back up at the hospital. He brings in a patient who has been shot, and he has to have surgery. Again, as you can see, brain surgery because he's got the bandages on his head. This is a lockpicker and safecracker professional thief. He's a suspect in a number of break-ins, and Inspector Lunge wants him healed and then wants to interrogate him. Tenma kind of gets in the way there. Of course, he wants his patient to recover fully and healthily, but Lunge doesn't take it great, but he understands. And then Tenma makes a mistake. He gets a little too close to this safecracker, and he hears his story and he says, as a doctor, he doesn't just have an obligation to try and heal the patient's body. He tries to heal the mind, and he sees that this is a man who has not always made good choices, but who wants to reform them, and he decides he's going to try and encourage that. He sees a souvenir of a clock, and the safecracker tells him, well, the first time I broke in to steal something, I broke in because I wanted a clock, and that got caught that time, so he went to jail instead of getting away with the clock. Never got that clock. So Tenma sees a clock and decides he'll buy it for his patient. He goes back to the hospital after his shift ends to give it to him. And this is where the story really starts. We're about 8 chapters in, and I know it's strange to say that this is where the story really starts, but it's true. Because when Tenma comes back, the guard by the door of his the safecracker's hospital room is dead, and this safecracker himself is gone. Tenma looks around through the window trying to figure out what happens. He sees the safecracker running across the yard in the hospital, goes out, chases him, and this is an interesting decision because we see that for all that Tenma is an intellectual, for all that he is an idealist, he's also a man of action because he bursts into action at this point almost instantaneously. We've seen this in a few other places. When he gets the calls for these late night surgeries, he's on it almost right away. So there are hints to this initially, but this is an important defining character moment in Tenma's life. And when he gets across the street, he finds the safecracker and a man in shadow in a parking garage. And the man steps out of the shadows and says, I'm really glad to see you, Dr. Tenma. You saved my life 9 years ago. So I guess not a full decade, but 9 years. And this man in shadow is revealed to be Johan Liebert. And he kills the safecracker to cover his tracks. And it turns out that this is not the first time Johan is killed. In fact, it turns out that Johan was not even an innocent boy when Tenma saved his life. You see, this man has killed before, he will kill again, and he will continue to kill because Dr. Tenma didn't let him die 10 years ago. And that's really where the moral conundrum of Dr. Tenma comes to bear. He has saved a life, now he is responsible for what has become of that life. Johan disappeared, presumably, everyone thought, into some kind of government safekeeping program. And Tenma never followed up with him. He never took the responsibility that his culture demands he take for the life he saved. And now that life has come back to him, and he sees how monstrous it is. It is not, Johan was not a child, not an innocent. And while Tenma may have had an obligation as a doctor to save his life, he did not follow up on that obligation as he should have, and now he is stuck with this responsibility, culturally speaking, if not morally speaking, for the lives that Johan has taken. That's going to change who he is and where he goes. That is also the end of the first segment here. And I think that setting up Tenma in this way, showing that he does his best to take these good ethical actions, but he doesn't always know what the outcome of those actions will be. He doesn't always follow through with them as much as he should. Because both times here, with the Turkish man and with Johan, he only finds out about these additional consequences because they come back and they land in his lap. He never follows up on these things. And while I think it's good that Johan is a strong moral actor, we also see that he's a little short-sighted in the decisions he makes. He is not going the distance with them in the way that he should to cut off these negative outcomes that are surrounding him. And it's an interesting and deep subject to dig into, and this story is going to look at that very deeply in the future. But for now, we've set him up. We've also set up his Javert, Inspector Lunge. Inspector Lunge thinks a lot of things about Tenma that aren't true. And he thinks them for good reason. Again, Inspector Lunge is a moral actor. But he also has the problem that Tenma has. He doesn't have the whole picture. We're going to see him grapple with trying to get that whole picture. And unlike Tenma, we're going to see him reject it a lot more than Tenma does. Because Tenma comes to terms with the reality of his moral situation very quickly in both of these cases, which we'll see more of going forward. So I think the interplay between these two very moral and principled people and Johan Liebert, who has no moral core whatsoever, is a very fascinating, very well handled piece of moral storytelling, the likes of which we almost never see today. So hopefully you will be interested to go on this journey with me. I'm really excited to break it all down in pieces with you. Until next time, let me know what you think of Dr. Tenma's introduction and the story overall, if you're familiar with the story as a whole. Anyway, that's what I got for you today. You can let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.